can you give us a bit of a recap of your concept of neo-feudalism?
Okay.
Firstly, what is feudalism? So we bandy so many terms around now. You're teaching a lot of young people. Most of them probably never heard.
You have that. You've got right. I've been in front of a class and there'd be 30 people and maybe 2.
Yeah.
And it's not the kids' fault.
No.
It's what they come out of high school with so little knowledge. I mean, I've had students say to me, "Well, during World War II, didn't we fight the Chinese?" I said, "No, we fought the Japanese, actually." I mean, and again, I think but here's where I see the parallels with feudalism. And obviously, there's nobody going around with chain mail and, on horses. One, you have the concentration of wealth and power. That was one of the essences of the feudal era, that very few people controlled pretty much everything.
No middle class.
Very small, struggling middle class with no rights, particularly.
And then a few peasants.
Right. Well, there were a lot of peasants, and they had even fewer rights. You also have the sort of religious fundamentalism. Now, the religious fundamentalism of today is not Christianity, although there are some who have that. The fundamentalism is more environmental, gender, race. Those have become the new religions, and there's no room for dissent. To have a good discussion on what we should do on climate change is as unlikely as expecting a bunch of bishops in 900 to have a discussion about the nature of Christ. I mean, it's that so there's sort of this inflexibility. Then this is interesting. Demographically, particularly Western societies all have very low birth rates and are, in many cases, are headed towards a diminished population. That's also the Middle Ages. We went through about 1,000 years where the world population didn't even grow.
We might come to energy in a moment because, of course,
Yes.
energy's been a big part of what's let it grow.
Right.
But can we unpack? This is what really jumped out at me. So there's some of the things you've been referring to. There's this concentration of power and wealth at a time when most Western economies, productivity stalled, real wages have been flatlining or even falling.
Yeah, certainly since the inflation, for sure.
Squeezing out those middle classes and the working classes. But at the top, so just some of your numbers are, I think here we go. 5 years ago, you write, around 400 billionaires owned as much as half of the world's assets. Half, 5 years ago. Today, only 100 billionaires own that share. And some estimates are that it's even less than 100. And there's a surprising parallel. China's much the same.
Yes.
Or more so.
Oh, yeah. China's now more unequal than the United States.
In a communist country where everybody's equal.
Right.
And nobody has private property.
Well, of course, that's not the case. The difference in China is your private property can be taken from you at any moment. And, I'm sure we'll work on it too.
So this astonishing wealth, hardly good for social harmony in a free country like America, in my country like Australia. When particularly the policies, Joel, we've been pursuing since the GFC, then through COVID, let's not go into the rights and wrongs on, now with climate, all of them, in my judgment, create more and more serious problems for younger people and poorer people.
Yes, definitely.
If you take the GFC and COVID, it's very easy to see. We were pursuing inflationary targets that were designed. There was a hope for inflation. We couldn't get it. Free money everywhere, cheap money everywhere. It made the wealthy wealthier, the poor and the young couldn't get a start. COVID, everybody's documented how we've built up debts that young people are going to inherit.
And of course, the terrible effects on education.
Climate change. The policies that these squillionaires out of the tech giants and those sorts of backgrounds, the policies that they are leaning on governments to provide. In fact, you would argue that government and those squillionaires are becoming inseparable. That's part of the problem.
That's clearly what's happened.
But they count against the middle classes, against young people, against the less well off.
Right, but the problem is that they also control much of the media.
Yeah.
And now you have I mean, and it's come out quite well recently that companies like Facebook and Twitter, are in direct contact with the CDC or the EPA, the environmental agency, or the people in charge with dealing with COVID, and they are literally censoring those things that the government officials don't think are good. I mean, it's and of course, one of the more outrageous ones was obviously the Hunter Biden thing, which Zuckerberg recently admitted. He said, the FBI agents told us that it was Russian misinformation. No, it turned out to be completely accurate. But so I think that the problem is that what you've got is a confluence of interests. Now, by the way, the clerisy and the oligarchs will have their fights. That will happen. Just like during the Middle Ages, there were many conflicts between even the bishops and the kings. That's one of the constant tensions in medieval history. Well, we'll see that eventually. Right now, those two classes have to work together because they're united in their opposition to the Trump people and to the Republicans in general, and against a lot of the middle class. But it's very, very difficult to see how we're going to get out of this particular pattern, because I think that when you look at the control of media, the universities, the cultural institutions, it's pretty one-sided. I'm not sure if it's the same in Australia, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Trending in the same line, very much so. Interestingly, we have more kids in the private sector, non-state educative sector. 90% of American school children go to state schools, as I understand it.
But that's also changing. A lot of growth in charter schools, a lot of growth in private schools, a lot of growth in homeschooling.
What does that say?
What the polls will tell you, if you look at Gallup, the belief in the institutions is at one of the lowest levels in the history of this country. Certainly since Gallup has been doing polls. They don't trust the universities, they don't trust the media, they don't trust the presidency, they don't trust the Congress, and they don't trust big business. That's all. And now they're increasingly skeptical of education. This whole business where we're trying to create sort of standards in education that are that have to follow the party line, if you will. That's very, very painful. I'm very proud that Chapman is one of the schools that I think has, to a large extent, stood up against that. But it's a terrible tide, and when the older teachers are gone and the younger ones who've been brought up in the system inherit, it will be a little bit difficult.
Yeah, the stats on the move in academia amongst professors, teachers, academic staff from roughly half and half only 30 years ago of either side of the sort of centrist line politically, to where it's overwhelmingly one side.
And it's a very different one side. I would say a lot of things. I would say I'm left. I was certainly brought up left of center.
This is the value of your perspective. You're not coming from either of those extremes,
right? And what I see is that many of my friends who are liberals and Democrats, but are horrified by what's going on. They're horrified by, policies that are clearly hurting middle and working class people. The sort of the demand of orthodoxy. I always thought, it's a good thing to have a debate. It's a good thing to disagree. Once the term "the science is settled," that is one of the more dangerous phrases. Science is settled is sort of like God has spoken. And
except the science is never settled.
Of course, it shouldn't be settled. I remember my father, who was quite a person studying in the sciences and medical sciences, and he once said, who killed the most people in the world? Doctors, because he said, what I learned as a medical student in Boston in the 1930s, that stuff killed people. We didn't know. We were just doing things that we didn't know would have that effect. So you change over time, as you know, and we don't. We look at things that aren't working. Like a perfect case that's very current, and I think will be current in Australia. You cut out all fossil fuels and you get rid of nuclear power. Then you decide that you're going to have everybody drive an EV. What do you think is going to happen? I had a wonderful discussion with a young guy who was a PhD engineering student at Stanford. He called me. He was asking me about EVs, and then he said to me, I said, well, what do you think about the energy side of it? And he said, I'm told not to ask that question.
Really?
Yeah.